coming up. Sarah Kopp is here for Tennessee. Making history in Chicago. But just so you know, one thing will never change. Ed Burke is not guilty, all right? Don't even think it, all right? He's an alternate still. Some things we'd like to keep. Some things... Sorry. Okay, let the show begin.
That's only the second time tonight Tim has done that, so, all right.
And
Tim.
I talked to Double, I was headed to the bar. So you know it's going to be a rocky night tonight.
All right, thanks, Tim. We love you. Appreciate it. Thanks for hosting us and all the other things going on here. Welcome to First Tuesdays, everybody. Glad to see you all here. I'm Mick Dumke. I'm with ProPublica Illinois. Thank you. Thank you. I said that so you would all applaud. Thank you very much for taking the bait.
And I'm Ben Jarofsky. I'm with the Chicago Reader and the host of the Ben Jarofsky Show. So there you go.
Just remind everybody, Ben, where can they hear the Ben?
Google my name, and it'll come right up. That's all you got to do. I just was talking to someone about this. Like, well, you can watch it at the Sun-Times site or the Reader's site. Then someone said, you know what? If you just Google your name, it comes up. So Google, now I got to spell that name.
That's right.
J-O-R-A-V as in victory, S-K-Y. So there you go.
Just do Ben and Tiffs.
In fact,
You'll find it.
Mick was on the show Saturday. Tim Tutton was on the show Monday. And Sarah will be on the show next week, though she doesn't know it yet.
So if you guys all keep coming, you'll be on the show at some
That's
point.
right.
In time.
Sooner or later, everybody. This young man in the front row is always on the show. So.
All right. Well, we think that Alden Lowry is on the way to join us. That's what we think. We hope. But whether he makes it or not, we have a great show. And did you say actually?
I think that's no.
I can't see a thing with this light here.
Well, we're glad you're here too. Okay. All right. Well, this is all a backhanded way of saying Sarah Kopp, thanks for coming back to First Tuesdays. Fantastic reporter primarily, but not always, just on education issues. And a dear friend of both of ours, and Sarah and I have known each other since we started working together 20 years ago now, actually.
So sad. It's
long
like,
time.
oh, wow.
How does that happen?
Yes.
And somehow it does.
Yeah.
All right, well, there's a lot we want to talk about. You know, Ben and I, every month, we're like, okay, we barely finish one show, and then inevitably, it's like, what are we going to do next month? And then we proceed to basically have a show that none of you get to see or hear when we're just talking on the phone, where we're going over politics and debating everything. But I think, Ben, correct me if I'm wrong, we had this idea because we were both so fired up when we saw the news about Rahm Emanuel being hired as a contributing editor for The Atlantic.
Someone else. Yeah. ABC News.
A commentator for ABC News. That surprised me less, though. I mean, George Stephanopoulos, there is some precedent for people who going from politics, and I guess to the magazine world as well. But it took us both aback. It took us aback.
I've mentioned this a lot on the show, and I've written about it. I'm really trying to deal with this, put Rahm in the rearview mirror, and his reign in the mirror. I mean, I went through this with Daley, put him in the rearview mirror, and just move on and talk about the Lori Lightfoot era. But this is the conversation that we had, and I've had this conversation with so many people. If Rahm is going to become a media observer and a critic and a columnist and a pundit, and he is going to make his positions on the worldviews known to the people, then I believe he should be accountable for what he did. So if he's commenting on things like education, would love to talk to Sarah about her opinions of Mayor Rahm's years just do a straight journalist. If he's going to be talking about criminal justice, as he did in a column where he was giving advice to Baltimore, if he's going to be talking about Peter Buttigieg's campaign and give advice to journalists, as he did in one piece, and what was, the last one where he talked about the need for Democratic politicians to be less elite-like. So I'm just saying, man, that's what the man wrote, okay? So if he is going to weigh in and make observations and recommendations and criticism, then I think it's only responsible, or it's only fair, and really it's our job as the people who covered this stuff in real time during his year to comment back. That's kind of what Mick and I say all the time to each other. So this show is supposed to be about, it started off being about Rahm's his legacy, Rahm as a journalist. What does that say about journalism in the 21st century, you know? But then all of a sudden Lori Lightfoot became real, you know what I mean? Got sworn in, attacked Ed Burke. So it's sort of like both now.
Yeah, I think
looking back and looking
there's room
ahead.
to do that. So one thing, sir, I wanted to ask you right off the bat is there's in education there's a very obvious connecting link. The schools chief, Janice Jackson, is Rahm's last pick of many. We went through a number of schools chiefs.
Five.
And now Lori Lightfoot has not only kept her on, but she seemed to signal in the last couple of days that, like, this is the person she wants there for the foreseeable future, not just a transition thing. What was your take on that?
I wasn't surprised. I mean, first of all, this was not Rahm's idea. I mean, Janice Jackson was not Rahm's idea. Rahm's very first idea was to go and get John Clark Brizard from New Jersey. And so his first thought in his mind was he wanted an outside superstar to come in and, you know, figure out what's going on with Chicago Public Schools. Second person he got was Barbara Byrd Bennett. You know, somebody from Cleveland / New York, come in, shape up Chicago Public Schools. So
These are both people who at that time had seemingly growing national reputations, right, as school reformers.
right, so he wanted, you know, these you know, new Democrat type people who are very into portfolio school districts. And I remember there was this word called bonded autonomy that they were floating around, which always seemed very odd to me, that they were going to give principals. So that's what he went and got. But he, you know, sort of learned the hard way. And then the next person he really got was, you know, just a bureaucrat who, you know, which was Forrest Claypool, you know, sort of the guy to do what he wanted him to do. So what I'm trying to say is that Janice Jackson was not his first idea. She's an insider. She knows the system. And, you know, the reason why I'm not surprised is I can't really think of somebody else in the system who he would get. You know, I mean, she basically, you know, she's the perfect candidate. She grew up in Chicago, went to all the schools in Chicago, and I mean, so far she hasn't messed up. So I guess I didn't really think that Lori Lightfoot would get a new person. There wasn't really a reason. So it's not surprising to me. I think some people wanted new leadership, but even they, when you said, well, then who? They were a little bit like, I'm not really sure who. So, you know, if you don't have a great alternative.
Well, one thing, going back to my theme about Rahm, talking about his great accomplishments, using his new platform to give advice based on his accomplishments. One thing which is interesting development, Sarah, is that now he's championing himself as an innovative leader of public education and applauding himself for his stewardship of Chicago's public schools and giving advice to other cities that they on how they should emulate from his success. So you covered the public schools under Rahm for almost the whole 8 years.
The whole darn 8 years.
You should get a raise.
Every moment of it.
And you covered it before. Were you covering it before Rahm?
I was.
So you were there for Arnie Duncan.
For Arnie Duncan and
Huberman and all the other
Right,
great
yes.
illustrious. So you know, talk about Rahm's stewardship of the schools, and when you think about Rahm's legacy as a leader of our public schools.
Well, I wrote something about this for WBEZ, and it took me it was really, really hard to sort of synthesize what my thoughts were. And because on one hand, you know, there is data that shows that there has been improvement in on tests, basically, and graduation rates have gone up, but, you know, maybe not quite as much as he says, or as the data says. There's some, you know, sort of funniness with the numbers, but there's no argument that there's at least been some trend upward. I mean, nationwide there's been a trend upward, and Chicago has been
In both graduation rates and test scores, or just graduation?
Well, test scores are hard to say, they're hard to say because there's not a national test on the NAEP, which is like a survey test. They have gone up, but even those have sort of stagnated post 2015. So it's a little hard to say how much he had to do with that. And anyways, it's hard to say how much a leader of a school system or a city that runs a school system has to do with things like test scores or graduation rates or what's the lag time. I mean, a lot of people will say that if there was an improvement, it was the result of 15, 20 years of changes. And, we might find out in 15 or 20 years that Rahm undid those changes, but we probably won't find out for 15 or 20 years. I think that the biggest thing that resonates for me that under Emanuel, Chicago Public Schools, as it was run, was in way more chaos than the previous time. I mean, under Duncan, it was peaceful. I mean, you could disagree with with everything that he did, or take issue with some of his policies, but there was peace. I mean, teachers didn't strike, leaders didn't. I mean, Duncan was there for a long time. There were education initiatives. Under Emanuel, there weren't really many education initiatives. Like, you can't really say, like, oh, he implemented this program, or he brought in this type of curriculum, or he had more reading coaches. That was his big... I mean, under Duncan, there were more reading coaches. There were more math coaches. There was some things like that you didn't see that under Emanuel. Instead, what you saw was first, 50 schools closing, which is chaos. Then what you saw was the CEO being indicted and resigning. Then what you saw was several years of budget austerity to, partly to make a point to the state that we needed more money. And then what you saw was a CEO resigning. And then finally we got to a point for like 2 years where it was relatively calm. But, I feel like even during those 2 years, people were just trying to shake off the craziness of the past, 6 or 7 years. So I would really say it was more chaos than anything. And whether those test scores or those graduation rates will hold or whether it will be affected by that chaos, I don't think we'll see that for a while.
I Sarah, really have a hard time, how do I put this, looking at test scores and then making judgments of whole systems based on test scores. I say this in part because I was so bad at test scores when I was, many years ago when I had to take them. So I try not to put too much stock in them anyway. But they're so obviously linked to poverty and income. And so a low test score in many ways is a reflection of the sort of economic makeup of a school system. And
one thing that is sort of still a question that's sort of outstanding is that Chicago Public Schools has lost a lot of poor kids. Yeah. I mean, the city has lost a lot of students, the demographics have changed, and how much has that been, our test score has been affected by that, and even our graduation rates. I mean, a lot of, I did a story not too long ago about how Janice Jackson touts the black male graduation rate a lot. Well, at least up until I did the story, she did. But
Sarah Carr.
The reason why those test scores have gone up is there's exactly two dynamics. That one, a lot of black males have left the city of Chicago. They're just not here. So the actual number of black males graduating has actually decreased quite significantly. It's just that they're gone. Yeah. And the other thing is that we've created these alternative schools that are like 3 hours a day where you can go online and quickly get a degree. And a huge number, like in 2013, before we had many of these alternative schools, about 5% of diplomas of black males came from the alternative schools. Now it's up to 15%. So, so what we yes, it is true. If you look at the numbers have, the percentage has gone up. But if you look behind the numbers, it's a different story, because I'm not sure that if somebody leaves Chicago and goes to Thornton and Harvey and drops out there, and then that person comes back to Chicago, which happens a lot, that doesn't mean that Chicago's still affected by the fact that young man is not in school.
Yeah. I remember one of our earliest shows here at the Hideout, and you were on stage with Linda Lutton. Was it Lauren was the third person?
Yeah, Lauren,
and you were saying the same thing then, and it seems as though it's education reporters in this town are always fighting this relentless wave of propaganda put out by Mayor Rahm's people. We're going to hold off on Lori. We'll talk about her later, what she's doing. But it was always this wave of propaganda, and it wasn't really about figuring out what's best for school children, what's the best strategy. It was always about promoting the mayor, promoting the mayor's people that he put in. And so reporters like you and Linda would always get these press releases, pulling apart, dealing with reluctant bureaucrats at the Board of Ed to give you the information you needed, filing FOIA requests. This is my memory of Rahm's years.
Right. No, it's
Well,
true.
to that point, I wanted to read a text message I got this afternoon, or earlier today, from a political operative who has worked for a number of elected officials around here, including worked in Rahm's administration, although not in education, but in another part of the administration. And this person said, if you guys are going to talk about Rahm's legacy, remember, this person worked for Rahm. If you guys are going to talk about Rahm's legacy, you have to talk about his cult of personality. Every one of his achievements, especially early on, was framed in this narrative that only Rahm can save us. Every corporate relocation was the master deal maker bringing jobs. He could not help himself from making everything all about him and the force of his singular personality. I think that that's a major departure from Daley and important to understanding his legacy.
Whoa, time out. That sounds like something I wrote. You're telling me some guy who worked for Rahm wrote that?
That is correct.
Man, that does sound like something I would write. Cult of personality, wow.
I remember the first couple of years, every single solitary press release, like, this is the first time this ever has happened in the history of mankind. And we'd be like, no, it happened just like a year ago. but it was
With a different name,
with
maybe.
a different,
but
right,
yeah.
right. I mean, it was always.
To that point, one of the things, I've read all those essays. So one of the things he talks about endlessly is the program where if you get a B average, a Chicago graduate, you get to go to
Star Scholarship.
Yes,
Star
he put a name on it. But my recollection is that we had a similar program under Daley, that if you had a high grade point average and you wanted to go and you were a Chicago resident and you wanted to go to a city college, your tuition was waived. Or am I right about that?
I actually don't know if that exactly happened under Daley, but one thing about that is that, most kids who are low income who go to city colleges, they don't pay much for it anyways. I mean, the biggest place where I think you see that Star Scholarship really helping is kids that maybe are undocumented, or even middle class kids who aren't like wealthy enough or have the money to afford like a 4-year university. It does help. But, one thing about that, too, is that there was a lot of sort of funny business with city colleges and their graduation rate, and he touted that a lot. And a thought that he was wanting to use a Star Scholarship to then say, oh, well, city colleges got better, but of course, when you're bringing those B students into the city colleges, it would make sense that those kids would be more likely to graduate, because they also maybe had the option to go somewhere else.
Yeah.
And there is some question whether it's even, if you do have a B average, maybe is it better to go to city colleges or better to go to a 4-year university? There's different people who would have different opinions of that.
Well, it certainly was something that he, on his extended victory lap that he was taking over the last few months, that he kept talking about over and over again. I I was following an alderman around this a couple months ago, right before the first round of the first election in February, and there was an event at Richard J. Daley College on the southwest side where supposedly it was like a ribbon cutting for opening a new wing of the college, but the whole thing was basically a ROM press event, and they had produced a movie about the Star Scholarship film, like a little film. I mean, it went on for like 5-10 minutes, and even Mike Madigan made a public appearance, talked about how Rahm was the education mayor and everything. It was incredible. I felt like, I mean, when I saw this text today, I did feel like I was at a cult event. It was like the whole thing was scripted, and we were all around during the Daley years. We saw some of this, but I just feel like he took all this to another level.
Yeah, I'll never forget one time I went to this north side little park district where they were unveiling a new addition for a school, or it might have been an entirely new school. I think it was a new Taft annex that they put on. And he had a whole video about how he's bringing stuff. This is before he didn't announce he wasn't going to run. It was like the summer before last. And somebody in the mayor's office, in the press office, actually texted me, and they said, well, I don't know if I can say this. What is this shit? That was what the text said. This was somebody in his press office. Well, but it was like one of those, it was like a shiny, beautiful, promo video. And I don't even know, I never saw that thing again.
When I noticed I know you were just rattling off the top of your head some of the significant things that education-wise that happened under Rahm's tenure, and the school closing was one. But I would add to that list the teacher strike
the teacher strike was a big one,
2012. And when you look back, what's your sense of the relationship that Rahm had with the teachers union and with teachers in general as his legacy?
Really, Ben?
Well, I mean, they were the very first people to call him on his stuff. He underestimated them, and even he said that he underestimated them. The thing that he did that was so significant that I think even as we were covering it, we didn't quite understand it because it was such a different thing, is when he pulled that 4% raise. He was only in office very short period of time, and he was like, we don't have the money to pay this raise, so it was promised in their contract, and he pulled it. Yeah. And that just pissed everybody off. Even the people who weren't big progressive, Karen Lewis people, I think people were just like, what, that's just wrong. But he emboldened that movement. I actually think that right now there's something, how does that union now work with somebody who says all the things that they want a mayor to say? I think that it's going to be it's an interesting thing because I think they have to change because there's no more enemy.
Well, that is a very good way of transition out of Rahm. I could talk about Rahm all day, but just to the 4%, I think and I'm paraphrasing his lordship, but I think what he said was the teachers got the raise and the kids got the shaft.
Yeah, he did.
And that really,
and don't forget that he or allies of his worked to change the law, right? So that to raise the bar for how many teachers had to approve a strike, and then there was the guy from Stand for Children who was caught on video bragging about how we pulled this fast one, we made it so hard for the Chicago public school teachers to strike, and then they turned around and basically said F you and struck.
Right. And I completely, at that point, I was like, oh, it's on. Because that union was, they were very strident, but also you could hear the rumblings. People were not happy.
Yeah. All right, so to make the transition on education, what you just said is really true. It's so hard not to continue the previous fight that you've been having, you know what I mean, with the new mayor. So I have this, I'd always tell Mick, I always give him 3 months honeymoon, or I gave Rob 3 months, all right?
Did you?
Did you really?
Who's counting?
Starting when? Starting 3 months before he took office? Or?
I can't remember. I was never good with numbers. But it was a little bit of a honeymoon. I just, before I said, this guy, man, what a joke. But I look at Lori Lightfoot, those nominees to her school board, her appointees, and I have to say that since Daley took control in '95, that's the best school board I've ever seen appointed in terms of people who've had actual experience as parents or teachers in the system, and maybe they'll be more receptive to people when they show up. You've been at so many board meetings, how cold and indifferent those board members are to the pleas of parents and stuff. So what do you think when you see this? You put it in the context of this big fight for an elected school board. Do you think that appointing responsible people who actually care about kids and parents and have lived that life, undercuts the movement for a school board? Should we put that to the side for an elected school board?
I think it remains to be seen. And I think that this is the thing. Like, yes, I think being sensitive to parents and to being responsive will be helpful to parents. But at the same time, these people still are somewhat beholden to Lori Lightfoot. I mean, they serve at her pleasure, and I think if they just always vote for everything, if it does seem like it's still theater. I mean, the tendency, I think, when you are on an appointed board is to still operate sort of like a private board, which is how they've operated in the past. So I guess I'd want to wait and see. But I also just think that at this point, Chicago wants to vote on the school board like everybody else in the state and most people in the nation.
Yeah.
And I think that, I think that impulse is still going to be there. And I actually think that not letting this go forward could backfire on Lightfoot.
How
a little
so?
bit.
What do you mean?
Well, because she held it up. And she said, I don't want a 21-member board.
Yeah.
And
This is a proposal that was put forward to have an elected school board with 21 people, and she basically said, I don't like this particular plan because that's too many. She says it's going to be unwieldy with 21 people.
I mean, the thing is that this is a bill that's been negotiated for a long time, right? So the people who are proponents of the bill point out that we have 50 aldermen. We have, other.
Do they argue that that's an appropriate number
Well,
as well?
I think that it's more though that if you have I think that this is the conflict. Okay, if you have a smaller number, how do you divide up the city? Or do they all serve at large? And if they all serve at large, then how do you prevent some of the big money coming in and that corrupting the whole process? So, and I guess in a way, what people are more upset about is it feels like we're going back to the same place that we were maybe, in like the late 2000s when they just started talking about an elected school board. Like, are we going to go back and rehab all the conversations and all the discussions that we've had for years and years and years? I mean, this has not been come up with like overnight. I just think that she's got to move the process forward, or else people will get sort of frustrated.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are two layers to this, at least two layers that I see. One is a legitimate set of questions or discussion to be had about what is the proper number. I personally don't buy that if there's only 11, then they're going to be somehow more or less corruptible. I mean, we
Well,
have 50 aldermen. Okay?
They're pretty corruptible, right?
Yeah.
But
Some are good and high quality, others not so much. And I think that is also true. There are other city councils around the country. There are other school boards that have a smaller number of people, and they seem to do well. But there is a legitimate discussion to be had about that. I guess the question I have is, a massive gambling bill was just passed where legislators didn't see, if they read it at all, they didn't see it until right before they voted on it. Like, it was still being rewritten through the weekend. And that's going to totally transform like the state of gambling in the entire Midwestern United States, if not the entire country. we're going to be competing with Nevada for gambling here if all those seats are actually put into play. So my point is, if you didn't like the number 21, how come Mayor Lightfoot or her people didn't cut a deal, didn't negotiate?
That was the thing. Like, why just sit on it? Maybe they thought, well, this is not our first priority. I mean, that's all I could think of. But I also think that she's got to be weighing some of what mayors have weighed in the past, and that's if I'm going to be accountable for the school district, if people are going to hold me accountable for it, then if I give up all the power, it's, you know, that seems like a bad trade-off. I mean, people are still going to blame her if the schools suck, and if she has no power over it, then, you know, how do you balance that? And I think that she's still got to figure that out.
What do you think with the element of just personality is involved? Now let's think about this. The proponents of the school board include the Chicago Teachers Union, who vehemently opposed her in the election. The sponsor of the school board bill is a gentleman named Rob Markwick, State Representative Markwick, who got to a face-to-face confrontation with her at an embarrassing press conference that I guarantee you Markwick wish hadn't happened, because it probably had as much to do with Lori getting elected.
It helped Lori, yeah.
Yes,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
has the Sun-Times endorsement. So part of me it just thinks it's sort of like, oh, that's what you want? Well, I'll make you wait, because now I'm the mayor of the city of Chicago.
It could be.
You
It
know.
could be. It could be. I mean, who knows? But if that's so, that doesn't. I don't think that bodes well.
No, it does not. Well,
That's the
yeah.
reason why you're holding up legislation.
The fourth person who's not here is Alden Lowry. I don't know what happened to him. I hope he's okay.
He's probably in traffic.
He's probably in traffic. Okay, and he's been. I know Alden really well. Mick's an old friend of his as well. He's a demographer who has studied population trends in the city of Chicago for a long time, and has a lot of interesting thoughts about policy and how that impacts population trends, et cetera, and so forth. So I'll pretend I'm Alden and ask you a question school-related. Two things. One, it seems to me that under Rahm, or let's remove him, for the last 10 years or so, we've had that theme in the city of Chicago. You know, Chicago is a tale of two cities. I really believe the school system has become such a tale of two cities. They leave it up to schools, individual schools, to raise so much money to cover so many. I know schools on the north side that do fundraisers to pay for a science teacher, for instance. It's not part of the regular budget. How in the world can a school filled with poor parents, people from low-income community, possibly expect to compete in that kind of environment? They don't have the potential to go to their parents. And if we're not adequately funding our public schools, that leads to this just inherent unfairness. Do you agree with me that this has gotten worse over years? Do you think it's sort of the same down through the years, or am I wrong? Am I being unfair in that it's actually improved under the last administration?
Well, I'm working on a story about this, but it won't be out till like November.
Scooping yourself.
So I don't want to talk too much about it, but I do think this is a big issue. I mean, you hear the buzzword, and not just in Chicago, but in the nation, is equity, 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 equity. That's all people talk about. And, you know, one of the things that has made the schools so inequitable in Chicago is that the fundraising goes completely unfettered. And there are places, and people are surprised, in this nation that do have some controls over how much people can raise, how it's spent, things like that. Chicago public schools, for the most part, looks the other way. You cannot ask them, tell me how these friends of groups are spending their money. They will tell you, we don't know. That's basically what they tell me.
We care. We don't
They're
care.
private groups, essentially.
They're
Is that what
private
they rule?
groups,
Yeah.
but this is the thing. Like, they're supposed to know. Like, they're like private friends of groups are supposed to be filing documents with the network office, and that's supposed to go to the central office that says that this is what money that we're raising, this is how we're spending. There's actually a form that principals are supposed to, you know, receive from those groups. From what I can tell, it never happens. Or if it does, it's like such a rarity that they can't respond to. They don't know where that paper is in their offices. It's in some drawer somewhere. So, I mean, it really just goes very, very much there. And also, all that money is supposed to go through the school's accounts. There's actually a fund that it's supposed to go through, but a lot of it is not. So you have people, teachers, working in schools that are completely not paid for by a government or even like a substantial organization beyond like the PTA or the Friends of Group. You know, I mean that's kind of crazy. Yeah. It's kind of crazy. It's kind of so I do think that's. I mean, you know, of course, the biggest problem is that we just don't fund our schools. That like people feel that the need to say, well, we want an art teacher. Well, that's something that you should have. You shouldn't have to fundraise. Yeah. But at the same time, it does create a big imbalance because it makes it, and you know what the worst part about it is that if your kid can go to a school where you can fundraise and you can make it sort of like a private-public partnership, then you might not be as concerned about raising taxes for all schools because it might not seem like that's the biggest thing. Yeah. So that's where it becomes detrimental to like.
No, it gets that let them eat cake attitude. Like, well, we had a fundraiser and we raised, at a silent auction alone, $500,000, and we paid for, I don't know if I want my property taxes to go up. I mean, I know what you're saying exactly. If you don't think of education as a common good that should be sponsored by the government, if you think it's sort of a quasi-private public partnership. And it undercuts an effort like a fair tax proposal that J.B. Pritzker is trying to push for. So, yeah, absolutely.
And this has become true of a lot of government services. Look at the parks. It's the same thing. There are friends of the parks for specific parks on certain areas. If you don't have that support system, you don't have the fundraising mechanisms in certain neighborhoods, they don't have the resources for extra goodies, for extra investment. I mean, why does Lincoln Park look so much different, so much better than a lot of other parks of comparable size around the city? And I think you can go on down the list. One thing I wanted to ask both of you about, if we take what's happened with Lori's picks for the school board and we talk about her picks for city council committee chairs, which to me seems kind of analogous. Some of the people she thought were, Ed Burke obviously was deposed at the very end by Rahm. She clearly she's now calling on him to resign. But there are a couple other committee chairs from the Rahm and Daley years who also got sacked with Lori's picks. But the bottom line is she's still making the picks. And we last month had Scott Wagasback here, who the new finance committee chairman, as Tim mentioned to us in the intro. If you remember that part of the intro. But, so is Scott an upgrade over Ed Burke? Probably most people in this room would say yes. But on the other hand, Scott was here saying that aldermen are supposed to pick their own leaders, and he said last month, we're not ready to do that. We don't know how to hold a vote in this. We literally don't know. No one in this room has ever caucused to decide who our committee chairs would be. So he basically said, I think it's going to be better to let the mayor do it again. So it's a different slate of people. You can argue a better slate of people, but the structure of what happens still hasn't changed. You still have a mayor controlling the city council.
Yeah. When we talked to Toni Preckwinkle before the election, and I thought she had a good answer. We were pressing her like, well, how about all the craziness that having an elected school board's gonna cause? And she said, well, that's sort of democracy, And we're like, well, I guess that's true. I mean, democracy is sometimes not pretty, but I think we've become scared of it.
Yeah, absolutely. You just stole the words right out of my mouth. Chicago does not do democracy well. We have this cynical attitude about it. Just look at the mayor's attitude, and many people have this attitude. But if we have an elected school board, oh my God, the teachers may elect somebody. Could you imagine that if the teachers elect somebody? Whoa, that's frightening. And it's just this attitude that somehow there'll be chaos. And this is such a Chicago attitude, Mick. I mean,
Well,
just like
it's
this.
it's actually common to other parts of the world. And
right.
I don't want to say what's going on here is comparable to a place like Egypt, but when Egypt was having its first elections, everyone was fearful, including the West, our country, that okay, if we let people in Egypt vote, they're going to elect Muslim radicals.
Yeah.
And sure enough, the Muslim Brotherhood won the elections. And then a couple years later, were thrown out. Now they're back to having a military leader for all practical purposes. And so I'm clearly not saying that the state of life in Egypt is comparable to here, but politically, structurally, I think that mindset is
that
kind of the
mindset
same.
is here, yeah. And when Scott, I was sitting right here when he said that. I think the subtext of what he was saying is that if I were to say it's up to the city council, then I will not be elected finance chair. And that's a reality. For all the wrong reasons, the other aldermen would not support Scott Wagasback for finance chair because he made them look bad by criticizing all the stupid things that they voted for. And they've never forgiven him for that. Instead of apologizing for voting for the stupid things they did. But I just think what you're saying is so true. There's this fear that somehow or other, if the mayor, so I think about the mayor's appointees to the school board and the issue that I write so much about TIFs. The school board has a position, has the ability to say, we are opposed to this. They could have opposed the Lincoln Yard TIF deal, and they went along with it. And they went along with it because they're appointees of the mayor, and they do what the mayor tells them. So does that mean the new school board will have the freedom to tell the new mayor, if she were to come up with an analogous project, no, we don't want to go for it? I don't know. I don't know what that situation will be.
And when do we say that reforms have happened? When different people we consider better, are in these positions, or when the structure has changed? I don't know. I mean, if structurally all of a sudden the city council had decided to pick its own committee chairs, and one of them was definitely not Scott Wagasback, if they, in their infinite wisdom, chose some of the same characters to run the same committees as they did before, yet they actually were doing what a legislative body is supposed to be doing, that would sort of be like, okay, step forward on one level, it's a step back on another level. Now this time, again, assuming we like Lori's picks or we think they're better, maybe there's a better slate of people, but the structure's just the same.
Yeah.
So, we're saying the same thing, but you're essentially holding out hope that, okay, we're not going to change the monarchy, but hopefully this monarch is more benign than the last one.
We're hoping.
Yeah.
By the way, that point you made about Ed Burke, Rom deposing, getting rid of Ed Burke as finance chair, I finally got around, I know I told you this, to reading the indictment against Ed Burke, all 59 pages. It's a fascinating document.
Yeah.
Really, it's way more interesting than the Mueller report. And
Well, the Mueller report didn't mention TIFs, but
Right,
so,
right.
yeah, that's true. That's true. That was a big oversight. But it was obvious to me that, God, I could talk about this forever. It was obvious to me that Burke's position as chair of the finance committee would be detrimental to getting this thing passed and getting 78 passed, because he was the property tax lawyer for both, and he was negotiating to be the property tax lawyer for the post office developers as well. That's the crux of one of the complaints about him. And he was negotiating for that position with Danny Solis, who's the chairman of the zoning committee. So both committees would oversee the passage of this bill while these guys are negotiating, trying to twist the arms of the recipients of the TIF handout for business. It was such an obvious shakedown. Right. And so they got rid of him, Mick. They may have had no choice, because what if you did a little digging around here? What would you have found out?
Well, not only
no
that,
potential.
but there's two other elements, at least two other elements, again, to this. As you have written and tried to educate the rest of us for many years, there's supposed to be a but-for rule with TIFs.
Yeah.
They're only supposed to be in places that wouldn't develop otherwise. The middle of the loop is not considered one of those places. So the whole notion that Ed Burke was never never caught on tape, do we know, contemplating stopping a TIF handout for the post office redevelopment because it didn't need the money.
Yeah.
He was going to stop it because they weren't going to hire
Kick him
his
in.
firm. He said the cash register hasn't rung yet.
And I'm going to defend Ed Burke right here, okay? Because and I just wrote, if you work from the assumption that clearly Ed Burke did, that this is a scam, that these people don't need this money, that we're just giving them money for something that they could easily pay for on their own, but because of this rigged system, they're going to get it, then I want mine. And that's how he viewed the world. And I have a similar attitude about the program. I'm like, if we have so much money in the city of Chicago that we could throw $1.3 billion to the developers of this thing, I want mine.
Then,
Just
damn it, I'm going to write 300 columns about
columns
it.
on this.
Right.
So that's Chicago for you, everybody.
Yeah. Well, the other layer to the whole thing, we should have questions, was that while Danny Solis was apparently conspiring with Ed Burke and egging him on, he was wearing a wire. So,
Just the whole thing is beautiful.
Yeah.
at what point did at what point was this familiar behavior for Danny, like practice behavior? Had he been doing this for years, or at what point in time is he sort of like he is just pinched so tight by the feds that he has to keep enabling Burke to do these kinds of
right.
things?
So in other words, that's a good question. Like, was Danny Solis constantly like going back into the 2000s, going to Ed Burke's office and trying to shake a deal to get?
I mean, he wasn't the zoning committee chair all the way back then, but anyway, it's we don't know what we don't know, but everyone should read the indictment. It is,
it's a good read, better than the Mueller report. I've read both, so there you go. Okay, the only guy in the world who's read them both. All right, yes, Frank, go ahead.
If Ed Burke gets indicted, what will happen with Amber, who's about to be the Chief Justice of the Illinois Supreme Court?
Oh wow, yeah. With Ed Burke getting indicted, what happens to Ann Burke, who is well,
In the fall, she's about to be Chief Justice.
she's on this. Yeah, she
Well,
well,
he was
she's
indicted. This
yeah, he
wasn't
was.
indictment.
Yeah.
Right.
So what
Yeah.
impact does that have on Ann
He
Burke?
gets arrested.
Yeah. Well, he is indicted. He was. We learned the difference between a criminal charge and an indictment. Actually, I could not articulate the difference between one and the other. I'm not quite sure what the difference is, but there is a difference. So yeah.
Well, I believe, and if there's lawyers out here, correct me, an indictment happens when there has usually, I think, maybe not always, when there's a grand jury who is investigated
Put it
and there's
down, yeah.
specific things where they're laying
So
out.
they hadn't put it to the grand
So
jury. Yeah.
law enforcement, police or the FBI could bring charges with the prosecutor, but then usually, I don't know, someone should bail me out here. if you
Anyway,
know the
yeah,
answer.
it sounded good. I don't know.
Yeah.
I was like, well, his father's a lawyer.
Yeah, right.
So Ann Burke, what do you think, Mick? Should Ann Burke become?
Well, I think it is. I mean, it is a problem for Ann Burke.
Who your husband is should not matter about what you get to do. I don't think that it matters. I mean, from all I've heard, Ann Burke's a good person. I mean, that's
She may be a good person. I'm not disputing that. I'm just saying politically, it's a problem. Do you really think that like they've never come over the dinner table? Maybe not the specifics of the attempted
I just
explosion.
shook down that TIF recipient. Oh man, pass the potatoes.
A state Supreme Court justice has no awareness of how the money came in to buy the home they live on or anything. I agree with you. She's not the one charged. I'm not saying she's committed any criminal wrongdoing, but I mean, politically, it's a problem.
Look, Tony Preckwinkle got annihilated at the polls in part because she took campaign contribution from Ed Burke. So
What she said was arranged by
Ann Burke.
by the
Right,
way.
yeah.
yeah,
The
so
party
I think
was
you
in
raise a
their
good
house.
question.
The party was in their
Their
house.
yeah. You raise a very
Correct.
good question. Yes.
So is there a story to why now with Burke as opposed to all the years that he got away with?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'm going to ask Mick Dumke that question. Why now with Ed Burke? He has been running a property tax business in the city of Chicago. I think Danny Mahopoulos' story said he had He had to recuse himself. I forget the number, but an enormous number. Usually I'd go, Frank, would you look that up for me? But Danny wrote that story for WBEZ, I want to say, about all the times that Ed Burke could not vote on a matter because he was representing the guy who was getting the money. So, Mick, why
Yeah,
now?
he still debated some of those, or
Yeah, he ushered him through,
yeah,
and he voted on
chaired
by
the
the way,
meetings.
the post office, the one he got indicted on. He voted on that one, even as he was shaking the guy down. So,
well, I don't know either, but the saying goes that that the feds operate on their own time, that they supposedly don't do things in conjunction with political timetables or whatever. Did something in this case? It looks like they got something on Danny Solis first, and they got him to wear a wire, and so. Then the stuff we know about Ed Burke appears to have come through, starting with recordings that Danny Solis made, and then they went and tapped his phone, put a wire on Ed Burke's phone. So it appears that it emanated outward from Danny Solis. And I can also tell you that around City Hall, there's a lot of talk and speculation about which aldermen are next. It's widely thought that this is not the end of the road, that there are other people who may very well be nabbed by this whole thing. All that said, it's speculation. They are pretty tight-lipped about this stuff. One thing I will say is that 464 times.
man,
Yeah.
right there.
There you go. Thanks, Frank. Is that what was interesting was the timing of the charges right before the elections in, it came out in December, early January, I think, right? And so that's very unusual. And the last time we saw something like that, we were talking about it, was the Blagojevich stuff, where it looked like they went and, or I think they arrested him, and then they maybe brought an indictment afterward. But they made a move before he was going to pick a permanent replacement for Obama's Senate seat. So sometimes they like to say they're hands off about elections, but sometimes they send signals basically saying something's coming down the road. You may know about this. You may want to know about this.
Yeah, but I think what you said is relevant to your question, is that getting Danny Solis to wear that wire was the key. Because that enabled them, that was his ally, and he went right into his office, and they plotted and conspired, and so I think that was the key.
So wasn't Danny Solis wearing a wire against Madigan originally? And then, there's that conversation between Solis and Madigan. Don't you remember that? It's not just me.
No, I definitely remember that one. That was about the Chinatown deal, and where Danny Solis ushered in some developers who were interested in developing a parcel of land in Chinatown.
At least one of whom has been indicted himself, I believe.
The developer?
Chu, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, that's a whole different, you're talking about the guy, there's so much corruption,
there's
Mick.
so many- Right.
Okay, that's Irving Park in Milwaukee, that's a whole different, that one was unbelievable. But anyway, but I think my memory, it's been a while since I read the articles about the Madigan one. It was Madigan just basically said, here's my card, call me if you want the business, and that ended it. Whereas, as opposed to Ed Burke was like aggressively, he goes, let's see him get it on the agenda if they don't hire me.
Didn't it seem like the feds were originally after Madigan, and they just happened to catch
could be.
Burke?
Yeah. Could be. That's a good point. Yeah.
Or they were, again, if they got Danny Solis, and they're sort of like, can you get Madigan too? We don't know what they were doing. We don't know what we don't know. That's the issue. But you're right. One of them brought up Madigan.
Danny Solis, for what it's worth, we've been doing this show for 5 years, and Mick, I've told this to Mick, was one of our earliest guests. He was on the stage with Rick Munoz, and it was right around the time he started wearing that wire. And now I'm thinking about, was he wearing a wire the night he got the Hideout? Oh, so tell me how you came to Chicago.
Yeah. He owes me money then if he's going to be recording a live.
Yes. It's a copyright issue.
My question is for Sarah. Again, not to interfere with your story that hasn't come out yet, but you're talking about the Friends of groups and such. Is there a, and you said that there's controls in other parts of the country and similar type of fundraising. Is there a functional way for CPS parents and to learn what those controls are and try to implement them without?
Well, there is the principals have guidelines that they're supposed to be following. They're supposed to be telling their friends of groups. So those, but you know, in California, for example, there's in different districts in California, they actually take any money raised and it has to go into a pot and it has to be distributed. And somewhere else, and I can't remember, with some school district on the East Coast, they take a portion and then they give some of it to other schools. But I mean, here we just have no idea what, like even to.
How does the, I'm sorry to interrupt.
Go on.
How does the factor of how the LSCs are supposed to approve the fundraising of the Friends of groups play into what the problem that you've seen?
Well, my question is, does that happen every time? I think that sometimes it does and sometimes it doesn't.
Do you think it'd be beneficial to get rid of LSCs and then
I think no. I think they do function. They do serve a function. However, I will say something that LSCs are not function well in a lot of parts of the city. I mean, there's a lot of schools they don't have quorums. I was just at a school the other day. I was outside and I was trying to ask some parents some questions, and the principal sent some LSC members out, and they're like, I'm like, who are you? And they're like, I'm out on the LSC, and I work for the school. And I was like, and I'm like, so are you a staff member? She's like, no, I'm the community rep. And I'm like, I don't think that's exactly how this is supposed to work. But so there's a lot of, I think there's some like, you know, troubles in some of those waters because, you know, there's a lot. I mean, schools are very autonomous, but I mean, I just think that if we could get a handle on how much is really happening, that would at least open a door so that we can figure out if there's maybe some way to make it more equitable. But I mean, you know, the truth is it's more about like the overall funding for Chicago Public Schools. I mean, people are using this money to buy things that in everywhere else are just things that you would have. You know, you wouldn't be told.
Yeah, you shouldn't have. I mean, there's something wrong with the system where parents fundraise to hire a science teacher. And a science teacher, in my humble opinion, should be paid for out of the allowance that the school gets from the state, from the city. And the notion that you have to fundraise to hire a science teacher suggests that there's a financial dysfunction with your public schools. They can't support themselves.
Right. And I mean, the question is, you know, are they hiring a science teacher because they're using their money for something else that they could be using for the science teacher? You know, I do think some schools are making decisions around that. I mean, but I actually think it's sort of fine if you want to use money from Friends of Groups for like a garden, you know, or even maybe for computers. But I think things that are more fundamental, I think that's where you get a little bit of the, you know, why do you walk into one school and you look at a kid's schedule in another school and it's just so fundamentally different?
I know Lori has put a temporary freeze on new charter schools. What's going to happen with the existing charter schools and the magnet schools? And you mentioned the principals also. With a new school board, what do you see as the future of Troy LaTraviere?
Oh, well, Troy just got reelected as head of the Chicago Principals Association. So I guess he's around to say. I mean, they must like him because he keeps getting elected. Charter schools, you know, she says she's not going to expand any, but I actually think that they're really suffering. I think that what we're going to see over the next 5 years is we're going to see like the ones that are networks that have become like almost their own little school districts. Those will probably be fine. Your Nobles, your Kips, your Aceros will probably be fine. But I think that as we, the charter schools, they're having trouble not just because of having unions that are demanding parity with Chicago public school teachers that a lot of them can't afford, but also the fundraising dollars that they used to get have run dry a lot of times because a lot of the sort of philanthropists that this was the big new idea. It's no longer the shiny new idea, and I think a lot of them are in more financial trouble than we know, and I don't know that I think that over time we're going to see them just like wither away, and we'll see some survive.
What about the magnets?
I think the magnets and the selectives will do fine. I mean, she says she's going to invest in neighborhood schools, but when it comes to high schools, on one side, high schools, I think that we're so far along on this like choice portfolio that it's going to be very hard to not continue on that. I mean, it's sort of how our whole system is built now. I mean, only like 20% of kids go to their neighborhood school, so.
How much?
20% of high school students.
Oh, high school,
But
okay.
even elementary school students, that number has been going down over the years. And I haven't looked at the number recently, but you know, it's somewhere around like 50% aren't going to their neighborhood schools. So I mean, we're pretty far down that path. But do I think that she's going to have a bunch of new selective enrollment schools? Probably not. You know, probably not.
You know, when I think about Rahm's legacy in education, I have to say, give him credit for this one. He probably did more to damage the credibility of charter schools by championing them early on. The north side of Chicago, his base, turned against charter schools by the end of his first term. You can't get a charter school on the north side. The only alderman I know who supported them was Joe Moore, and he was just ousted.
Booted.
He got booted. I can't think of one alderman on the north side of the city of Chicago, if there's any north siders can correct me, please correct me, who is championing charter schools. I can't think of any right now. Even Pat O'Connor kind of backed off a little bit. So, hey, thank you, Rahm, for that.
That's even true on the south side and the west side. There aren't many aldermen that really support charter schools. And, you know, maybe there's one or two, but there's not a whole lot that are like that would stand up and say, I support charter schools over neighborhood schools.
You know what?
Not
And
many.
let me just say this: the philanthropists are not giving it to charter schools. You're just proving my point. I've always felt that charter schools' usefulness was to destroy a teachers' union. That was what they were useful. That's why the Routers of the world invested so much in them. And now that they're unionizing, well, they're not that useful anymore. So it's like now they're pulling. Oh, now you're pulling back the money. You know, and then you pay the teacher a decent raise. Oh, we don't want to contribute to your school anymore. All right, okay, I see where you're coming from. Anyway,
Sorry. Not going to let us sit here and talk about education and not mention the fiscal dead end that CPS is heading towards. Say a lot about Rahm, but he at least understood that there were some fiscal issues with CPS. See the school closure policy, however terrible it was rolled out. Behind it all was at least a little bit of understanding that we are operating outside of our means, and we mentioned that population loss. We mentioned charters. Lightfoot was one of many candidates who gave very little substantively about what they plan to do about the pension crisis. Do we have any insight on that from the panel, or any thoughts, just similar to the charter school question, just open-ended, the plan?
I think you're totally right that Lightfoot is going to have to make some hard decisions because while we're better in financially, I mean, the pensions are, you know, we have more money coming from the states for the pensions. I mean, we're still spending a goo-gob of money on pensions, and we have some schools that just are not viable for one reason or another. I mean, there are schools that have less than 200 kids in them. I mean, high schools with less than 200 kids. I think that, and it's not even a financial problem as much as it is, whether those kids are getting a good education in those schools. Can she revive them? I don't know. But I will tell you one thing. When she talks about a moratorium on school closings, and when she talks about a moratorium on charter openings, one thing that she said when we interviewed her before the election is, I said there was a moratorium. I didn't say how long.
Oh, that Lord. sorry. She's already learning.
Very lawyer,
Yeah.
very lawyerly.
Yeah,
huh?
very
Yeah.
lawyer. By the way, I would just sort of challenge the underlying assertion of the question. I do not believe that Rahm, in any serious way, for his first term, took a look at city finances or public school finances. If you take a look at the public schools, just think about this. You have a declining population, and you're adding charter schools. Right there that says you're not thinking strategically, you're not thinking in terms of what's in the best needs of the students. Why would you add schools, charter schools, to a system that's losing kids? You're automatically undercutting population in many of your schools, thus justifying the reason to close them, thus causing even more turmoil. And that's just one example. We're talking education here, but Mick and I could go on and on about his punting on pensions, hoping that the state Supreme Court would deliver a decision for him on pensions that every lawyer in the city of Chicago told him wasn't going to come.
Hoping for a casino that didn't happen till this past weekend.
This past weekend. So.
Why would he close the schools, and why would he take on the most powerful union in the city? Like, I know you hate him, but like,
It's not a.
But it was.
But you know,
Behind it all, he sought to take care of.
they did need to right-size the system, and you're right that
And they weren't the most powerful union in the city of Chicago.
Until
Can I just add one thing to the conversation as we're talking about pensions and Social Security? Illinois teachers and CPS teachers do not get Social Security, they only get pension.
Right, that's right.
So just in case people in this room weren't informed of that, it's very important that you don't, our pension is our Social Security. So that was a dirty trick that Daley played and Rahm is cleaning up, but also I just wanted to clarify.
Yeah. Yeah, no, first of all, the Chicago Teachers Union was not the most powerful union in the city of Chicago. I would say that under Rahm's, the Fraternal Order of the Police had more political power than Rahm. By far, you never saw Mayor Rahm take on the Fraternal Order of Police. I would say the Firefighters Union had more power than the Chicago Teachers Union. Rahm cut his deal with them early on to make sure that he wasn't going into his reelection campaign. So I think the decision to take on the Chicago Teachers Union was a strategic decision because he thought they were weak and he could beat them, and he thought the public would be with them. He misread the public. He misread the Chicago Teachers Union, and we as taxpayers in the city of Chicago paid a price. That's just my opinion on that one.
I mean, he has raised property taxes that Daley wasn't, which is something Daley wasn't willing to do. And you're right. I think there's been at least more of an acknowledgement of the problems that the city and the CPS face. But those of us around the table have had this debate with each other and with our colleagues, with other people out there about whether there's any substantive steps forward on any of those things. So I think I will give Rahm credit for basically breaking the seal on raising property taxes. If that's a good thing, it needed to be done. He did it. I give him credit for sort of taking the heat for that because Daley didn't do that. That's why we sold off the parking meters and all that kind of stuff. But are we in a fundamentally better place than we were before Rahm took over? I think that is probably a whole other conversation. Yeah.
Well, I will say that the one thing that I do think is good that happened was the education funding law that was passed in 2017 by the state. I mean, and whether that would have happened had not all the craziness happened that, with under Claypool where, he threatened not to open schools and he threatened this and he threatened that. But at the same time, when you talk to people out there, one problem was that they never really believed that like Claypool and Rahm were doing it for the right reasons. I feel like people felt like when Claypool stood up there, like he was, the civil rights hero, and like, I'm doing this. It just wasn't the blue. It wasn't. People were like, I don't think so. I mean, it was. Yeah. I mean, he was, and he really did. And I think that was part of the problem is that he didn't. As a politician, I think that he misread a lot about how to interact with the public and what was really important to people.
Yeah, we have to wrap up here, but I think in politics, style does matter a lot. So even the school closings, we could all debate this, whether it needed to be 50, whether it needed to be those schools. Remember, during that whole process, the reasons kept changing for why these schools had to close. It was money, it was poor performance, it was to bolster the neighboring schools. It just kept shifting. So nobody believed him in the end that any of it was for any solid reason. And one other point I'll make is even the school funding thing, Rom benefited from having a villain in Springfield. He had Ronner.
That's right.
And Ronner was, I mean, it was dysfunctional. I'm not saying that this was good for the state or the city, but politically for Rom, you know, he had Rom. He had Ronner that helped Rom politically, you know. And then he had Trump at the end.
Yeah,
I mean, so Rom's a national revival. Rom was seen as dead in the water a couple years ago after Laquan McDonald, and Trump has helped revive Rahm Emanuel politically for the rest of the country. So.
One more thing to love about Donald Trump.
Yes.
Just add it to that list. All right.
Yeah, I think Tim is giving us the cutoff sign, and when Tim is cutting us
when Tim
off,
cuts us
you
off.
know
We
it's
gotta
real.
go.
Yeah, no
Tim.
one cuts me off,
That's
but
right.
I can cut you off.
That's right.
Yeah.
He's the Richard J. Daley of this establishment. So.
I will take that under advisement. All right, do you have a comment or a motion you wanted to make?
All right. Well, thanks again to Tim. Thanks, Sarah, for coming out. And,
we will
and
have a
diving into the
July
weeds.
show. I think the Tuesday in July is July 2nd, so no excuses.
Yeah.
We're gonna have
If
a
you've
July
gone fishing
show.
for the whole week, okay, we'll miss you. But we'll be here.
Right.
We don't know who's going to be
We
with
have no
us.
idea.
It may just be.
Alden will show up.
Yeah,
Maybe Alden will be there by July 2.
Alden will walk in.
Well, thanks to all you guys for coming out. Really appreciate it. And hopefully we'll see you on July 2.
Thanks for coming out, and keep on the Hideout website. The mayor should be here later this month.